Once upon a time, there was a wildly curious girl named Alice who, after she had had a series of adventures in Wonderland, discovered it was possible to step through the mirror above her mantle into a world where everything was reversed. Running through the forest there, she bumps into the White Queen, who can remember future events as if they'd already happened. She introduces Alice to the idea that a person can remember in both directions, the past and the future. The Queen tells Alice it's a poor sort of memory that only works backwards. And then the Queen asks Alice her age, it's 7.5, and the Queen tells Alice her own age, 101, 5 months, and 1 day. And Alice responds saying, "I can't believe that." "Can't you?" the Queen responds in a pitying tone. "Try again. Draw a long breath and shut your eyes." Alice laughs and says, "There's no use trying. One can't believe impossible things." And the Queen tells her, "I dare say you haven't had much practice. When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." What do you think? Can a person believe impossible things? Should a person try? What if those impossible things are true? Once upon a time, there was a city that believed possible things and dreamed possible dreams. Their dreams were big, but they weren't impossible. And the things they believed about themselves were all true. They had a lot of ability and a lot of wealth and a lot of power. So they had confidence in the inevitability of their own progress. They were wealthy and powerful and influential, and their population was growing. Their ambitions were achievable. There was no reason not to believe that they could continue on this course. The name of this city was Siena. It emerged as a republic in the gorgeous rolling hills of Tuscany in the 1100s, and by the early 1300s had grown into a thriving and prosperous city-state with a population of 50,000. As their wealth and power and influence grew, the city began an aggressive and impressive building campaign of structures that still stand today, all these centuries later. A palace filled with frescoes, one of the tallest towers in all of Italy, one of the greatest public squares in all of Europe, and the cathedral, one of the most stunning Gothic churches in all of Italy. Spurred on by a rivalry with the city of Florence, Siena made plans to double the size of their already enormous cathedral, which would make theirs the largest cathedral in all of Tuscany. They got started, and they worked on it for 9 years. And then, catastrophe hit. The bubonic plague, the Black Death, swept through Europe, hitting urban centers especially hard. It was the deadliest pandemic in human history, and Siena was not spared. By the time it was all over, the plague had killed somewhere between 50 and 75% of the population of the city. Artistic activity there ceased. Plans for building and expansion were halted. The city never recovered from the devastation. They never again became what they had once been, and they never resumed their plans for expanding the cathedral. What remains now is still breathtaking. It's a medieval masterpiece of architecture and art, both inside and out. If you go to Siena now, you will still see the old cathedral much like it was back then. And as you approach it, you will see one of its most striking aspects: the bands of light and dark marble. Open one of the huge doors and you'll discover that this motif is carried on inside and multiplied to stunning, almost dizzying effect. It's a kind of wonderland. It's like stepping through a looking glass into another world. It is unlike any cathedral anywhere else. It is entirely Sienese. The dramatic black and white stripes carry on all the way up inside, up the enormous and seemingly endless columns, and then they spill out onto the walls high above, and then way up top, soaring over all the geometry of the stripes and the columns, spread out above the severity of the light and the dark, is this vaulted ceiling, midnight blue, spangled with golden stars. And then beneath the columns is 14,000 feet of floor, every bit of it covered with inlaid marble mosaic. The interior of the cathedral seems to go on and on. It's cavernous, it's filled with sumptuous works of art. It's decadent. Everywhere you look is movement and story and stripes and the interplay of light and dark. You walk and walk and walk down the long, narrow nave, and eventually you will make your way to a singular work of art, the pulpit, carved from marble by master Niccolo Pisano, who also designed and built the cathedral itself. Pisano was commissioned to sculpt this pulpit after he had created a similar but simpler one in Pisa. It took 3 years and the help of 3 men, including his son, to finish it. This pulpit is Pisano's masterpiece. Some consider him to be the first sculptor of the Italian Renaissance, and they consider this pulpit to be a transition point from Gothic to Renaissance, which was a move forward by looking back. Pisano was drawn to the classical style of ancient Roman sarcophagi and crowded, compressed compositions. You could see it as he worked to portray natural movement and the fluidity of the narrative and the expression of human emotion. One art critic describes Niccolo Pisano in particular as perhaps the most underrated artist in the history of art, saying he was light years ahead of what any other artist, whether sculptor, painter, or architect, was doing at that time. The panels of medieval pulpits functioned as a kind of canvas on which spiritual truths could be communicated. The artists were visual storytellers, and this pulpit tells the story of salvation from the Nativity to the Last Judgment. Each of Pisano's panels has a forward flow to it, a way of leading the eye to move around and then move forward. You look at the panel and it draws you into the various pieces of the story and then pushes your gaze to the bottom right corner and then on to the next panel, almost like the turning of a page. Each panel is so full of life and motion that it almost spills out of the pulpit and into the people. But there's something particular and unusual about the way Pisano tells the story of salvation on this pulpit. Look at the first panel, the panel of the Nativity. We see the pieces of the story we would expect to see. There's Mary, reclining in the middle, having just given birth. And there, just above her, is the swaddled baby, with the ox and the donkey leaning their heads forward to get a look. Below her, in the lower right, are 3 sheep and a goat, and there in the lower left is the baby being bathed by midwives. But notice where the story of this panel begins. Look there in the upper left, where you would expect to see the Annunciation. In fact, Pisano's pulpit in Pisa has a very similar nativity panel to this one, though it's simpler. But the panel in Pisa has the Annunciation right there in the upper left as the starting point of the story. The Annunciation is where that story starts, but not here, not in this pulpit. Here, the story begins not with an angel's announcement to Mary, but with Mary's visitation to Elizabeth. On this pulpit, this is where the story of the Nativity begins. In fact, on this pulpit, this is where the story of salvation begins, with 2 women talking. They are small and they could be difficult to see in this crowded scene. It's high up from the floor too, so you have to study the panel for a bit before you find them. When we were there last year, I actually looked all over this pulpit looking specifically for the Annunciation. It's one of my very favorite scenes from Scripture, and a scene I'm so interested in seeing depictions of. So interested, in fact, that I had started on our trip finding the Annunciation even when I wasn't actively looking for it, and starting to see it in places where it wasn't, but not here. I looked and looked in Pisano's panels for the Annunciation. Not there. In this panel, the Annunciation is a given. In fact, you can see the left corner post has Mary by herself. She's posed as we see her depicted often in scenes of the Annunciation. So you can tell that the corner post depiction of Mary is her having just received the news of the angel, but there's no angel there. That corner post gives us a little nod to let us know the Annunciation is a given. It's backstory. In this portrayal, in this panel, the story of salvation gets its start when the news is shared. It starts with the visitation, the embrace, the blessing, the believing. These are the last words we hear from old Elizabeth to her young cousin. Blessed is she who believed that there would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her by the Lord. Mary has not only been chosen by God to bear God's life into the world, she has believed that it would be so. She has believed it. And Elizabeth? Elizabeth believes her. Elizabeth believes her before Mary ever explains a word. Elizabeth believes her. Is there anything more validating, more affirming than being believed? Is there anything that feels more like an embrace than having someone believe you and believe in you. Sometimes we are like Mary. We believe. We believe in God's promises. Sometimes we're like Elizabeth. We recognize and affirm the belief of others. And sometimes we're the ones who need to be believed. And sometimes we're the ones who need to be held up by and carried by the believing of others. I wonder if Elizabeth held Mary up along the way of her pregnancy. I wonder if Mary held Elizabeth up along the way. You can see that here, even in this little depiction. You can see how they lean on each other, how they lean into each other. You get a hint that perhaps part of the power of the visitation is that not only do they each carry a child, they also carry each other. The small carving of these two women in the busy, crowded scene of this panel does not allow for the same level of detail that we've looked at in the paintings we've spent time with this Advent. But you can see the closeness and the clasping and the concern they have for each other. There's a tenderness there. There's a fidelity there. Their belief in God is embodied in how they believe in each other. We know what happens next in the story the way Luke tells it. The women are transformed from expectant mothers into prophets, heralding a new age. As Elizabeth pronounces a series of oracles disclosing Mary's identity as the mother of the Lord, explaining the meaning of the baby in her own womb, and pronouncing a beatitude on Mary for believing that God will fulfill God's promises. Elizabeth is a prophet. She is the first one to see and to say the truth of who Mary is and who is in her womb. Mary opens her mouth to respond, and what comes out is a song as fierce and fiery as any proclamation any prophet ever made. My soul magnifies the Lord, she begins. And from there, the song tumbles forward, singing of the future as if it were the past, as if God's promises had already been accomplished. She sings of God's turning of the world, of God's overturning of the structures of the world. The proud scattered, the mighty dethroned, the lowly exalted, the hungry filled, the rich sent away empty. She sings of all of this as if it has already happened, as if the whole world has already been transformed. She is that certain of God's power. She is that certain of God's intention. She knows that it's possible to believe impossible things. She knows that God makes impossible things possible. She knows because God's impossibility has already taken root in her own body, in her own life, in her own being. And she believes that what God has done in her, God will do for the whole world. She is remembering forward. She is remembering in both directions at once. God's past faithfulness, God's future fulfillment of promise. She sings of what shall be as if it has already been, because she believes. The proof inside her is all she needs. She believes impossible things because they're true. And Elizabeth believes her before she says a word. When life as you know it gets swept away, when the seemingly possible dreams and plans you had for the future get destroyed. It's hard not to let your dearest beliefs fall away with it. Whether it was the belief in the inevitability of your own progress and prosperity, or the belief in the basic goodness of your fellow citizens, or the belief in what you thought God was supposed to do and to be. When so much of life gets turned upside down and inside out, it's hard to know what to believe anymore about the future, about God, about yourself. Advent is a season that reminds us to remember forward. We remember forward and we try to believe. Try to believe that God is faithful, that God will fulfill God's promises, that God is with us, that God is God, that God is good. We try to believe things that seem impossible, and Elizabeth and Mary show us what that looks like. Two women talking. One of the smallest, most insignificant seeming happenings in the world. Just two people leaning towards each other, leaning on each other, seeing God alive in each other, blessing each other, believing and bearing each other up. Two people telling what they know. These two people know impossible things. And it doesn't matter that they're impossible to believe, because they happen to be true. If something is true, it's true, whether we believe it or not. Which means it's okay if you struggle to believe, because the truth does not depend on your belief. The truth does not depend on your belief in it. It's just true. And here is the impossible truth these two women know. God is born among us. God is born among us. You carry a piece of God in you, and God carries all of you. Believe it or not, but oh, blessed is she who believes.